Hello, I'm Keith Hockton, author, historian, and host of Rearview Mirror Chronicles, where we take a look back at the people and the moments that shaped our world through history. So I guess the question is, why are we so fascinated with ancient Egypt? And I think the answer is because it refuses to stay dead. This is a civilization that looked straight at mortality and didn't flinch. While most cultures accept that time erases everything, Egypt actually tried to outwit it. Names carved into stone so souls could survive, bodies preserved so life could continue, tombs packed with food, with furniture, with pets, even jokes for the afterlife. You know, death was not an ending. It was a carefully planned journey. And of course, then there is the sheer confidence of it all. You know, the pyramids are not just big, they are defiant. They are 4,500 years old, and their statements basically saying, we were here, we mattered, and we expect you to remember us. And you know what? Somehow we do. Egypt feels alien. Gods with animal heads, spells written for the dead, kings who married their sisters. Yet the people beneath it all are actually painfully familiar even now. They loved, they worried about money, they feared illness, they wanted their names to last. That strange mix of the recognizable and the unknowable, it pulls us in every single time. We're also drawn to Egypt, I think, because we rediscovered it in modern times, dramatically noisier, under desert suns and newspaper headlines. I remember reading about when the tomb of Tutankhamen was opened in 1922. And even then, it actually felt like the past had suddenly pushed the door open and stared back at us. And I think perhaps most of all, Egypt fascinates us because it asks the question we never stop asking ourselves. What survives us? It's not money. It's not power. Not even memory, unless you fight very hard for it. Ancient Egypt was humanity's boldest attempt, I think, to answer that question. And it's still answering it thousands of years later. That brings me to Hatshepsut. She's one of the most extraordinary figures in ancient Egyptian history, a pharaoh who didn't merely inherit power, but constructed it, defended it, legitimized it with astonishing skill. You know, she ruled for more than 20 years, presided over an era of stability and prosperity, and left behind some of the most iconic monuments of the ancient world. But here's the question that really matters. How did a royal princess and a queen consort become a pharaoh in her own right, not a regent, not a placeholder, but actually a king? I've been thinking about that a lot recently, partly because I just finished reading Brief Histories, Ancient Egypt, a really beautifully clear and readable overview of ancient Egyptian history by Campbell Price. And it was actually published late last year in 2025. It's one of those books that does something dangerous. It makes you curious. And Hatshepsut leapt off that page. So much so that I actually found myself playing that very familiar historical game. If you could invite one person from the past to a dinner party, who would it be? And you know what? Unexpectedly, she went straight to number one. Now, when people think of ancient Egypt, they usually reach for the obvious names: Tutankhamen, Ramesses the Great, Khufu, the builder of the Great Pyramid himself. If they think of royal women at all, they think of Cleopatra. But I always lean towards Hatshepsut, precisely because she is less well known, despite the fact that we actually have more evidence for her than for many of the better known figures. With Cleopatra, much of what we think we know comes from later historians, often Roman, often hostile, often more interested in moral lessons than accuracy, I have to say. With Hatshepsut, we have something very different. We have buildings, we have inscriptions, we have statues, reliefs, texts, and administrative records. We have evidence not just of her existence, but of her inner circle, her officials, her architects, and of course her priests. The raw material of history rather than legend layered upon legend. And I think that's why she fascinates me. You know, she was a profoundly powerful woman who ruled Egypt successfully for over 2 decades. And I can't help but wondering what she was actually like. What was she like in a room? What was she like at a table? How did she speak? How did she persuade? So let's get into it. Who was Hatshepsut really? And when we are dealing with ancient history, how close can we actually get to someone like her? I think the honest answer is not very close at all. And this is where we need to slow down just a little and be a little bit careful. We can't write a biography of her in the same way that we might write one of, I don't know, a 20th century politician or a monarch. There are no diaries. There's no letters home, no confessions of doubt or flashes of temper that are actually preserved for us. We don't know her inner life. We don't know her private motivations. And of course, we don't know what she feared or what kept her awake at night. What we have instead, I think, are actions and images and titles, and of course, incredible monuments. We have what she chose to show the world and what others were instructed to record. Filling in the gaps, talking about intention, ambition, personality, that's where historians have to tread incredibly carefully. So consider this a caution sign. I'm going to talk in biographical terms, but this isn't a biography as we would recognize it today. It's closer, I think, to a reconstruction built from stone in a way, and text, and also silence. So with that in mind, what do we know about her earliest life? Can we even begin to pin down where she was born or what kind of childhood she might have had? This is where her story truly begins. So when we're talking about Hatshepsut, we are really talking slap bang in the middle of what most people imagine when they think of ancient Egypt. If you picture Egyptian history as a long arc, the unified kingdom comes together approximately at 3000 BCE. And it ends, at least in the pharaonic form, with the death of Cleopatra VII in 30 BCE, followed swiftly by the arrival of Augustus and the Romans. Hatshepsut sits right in the middle of that span. She is 15th century BCE, roughly the 1400s before the Common Era, the peak pharaonic Egypt. What do we actually know about her and her background? Well, we know quite a lot about her father. He was Thutmose I, a man who doesn't appear to have been especially exalted of royal birth. His legitimacy seems to have been strengthened by his marriage to Hatshepsut's mother, Ahmose, who held the title of Great Royal Wife. And she was almost certainly of proper royal blood herself. And that marriage really matters because in Egypt, bloodline is everything. And it helps anchor Thutmose I firmly on the throne. Thutmose I was first and foremost a warrior king. He was energetic, he was expansionist, he was pushing Egypt's influence into Namibia and the Near East. Hatshepsut then is born a royal princess. And at a moment, I think, when Egypt is powerful and confident and outward looking. She is the daughter of a pharaoh, part of a large royal family with multiple siblings. And crucially, as was entirely normal, it was assumed that a male heir would rule. The king was not just a political leader, he was the living embodiment of the male god Horus. Egypt expected kings, not queens. Hatshepsut accordingly marries within the family. Her husband is her half-brother, Thutmose II. He is, it's fair to say, not one of history's towering figures. You know, some Egyptologists have actually been rather unkind and nicknamed him Thutmose the Useless, which is maybe a bit harsh. but he doesn't reign for very long and he leaves very little mark. But together they have a daughter, Neferuri, but no surviving male heir. When Thutmose II dies, the throne passes to Thutmose III, a child born to a secondary wife. And that actually makes Hatshepsut both his aunt and his stepmother. And at this point, the biographical basics are in place. We have a powerful royal woman, a very young boy king, and a system that absolutely expects male rule. And of course, all of this unfolds within the 18th dynasty, the first great dynasty of what Egyptologists call the New Kingdom. And this is actually really important. The Old Kingdom, the age of the pyramids, is already ancient history to Hatshepsut. The pyramids at this stage are more than 1,000 years old by the time she's born. And of course, they are monuments of a deep past. And I think Hatshepsut knows this. She deliberately references, quotes, and visibly echoes earlier great kings. She presents herself as part of a long, unbroken tradition of divine kingship. That, to me, suggests something fascinating about her mindset. She seems unusually aware of history, ancestry, and precedent. She's not inventing herself out of thin air. She's anchoring herself in Egypt's deepest past. Which brings me to what might cautiously be described as complicated family dynamics. What was her relationship like with her husband and half-brother, Thutmose II? Look, emotionally, I can't say. We simply don't have that kind of evidence. But materialistically, archaeologically, something interesting has emerged very recently. Within the last year, the tomb of Thutmose II has been identified. It's not in the Valley of the Kings, but it's nearby. And that matters because it's only after Hatshepsut's reign that the Valley of the Kings actually becomes the fashionable place for royal burial. Thutmose II belongs to the generation just before that seismic shift. His tomb was actually badly damaged, little more than underground chambers, but among the objects recovered there were items bearing dedications from Hatshepsut herself. So that tells us something quietly powerful. It strongly suggests that Hatshepsut arranged her husband's burial. She commemorated him, and she actually tells us that she did it. I think whatever else she was certainly very careful with memory, with ritual, and with the visible duties of kingship. Even before she becomes king herself, she is already acting like someone who understands exactly how power, legitimacy, and remembrance work in ancient Egypt. And I think that sets the stage for what comes next. The detail is unusual. Ordinarily, it would be the next king, the next male king's son, who oversees or oversaw the burial of the previous ruler. In this case, that should have been Thutmose III, but his father dies while he's a very small child, a toddler most likely, perhaps 2 or 3 years old, and he's definitely not issuing funerary instructions from the crib. And yet, it's Hatshepsut who is explicitly named as being responsible for that particular burial. And that matters. It tells us something about her standing at court, and it hints at the nature of her relationship with her husband. Not emotionally, because we can't go there, but politically and ritually, she is already operating at an extremely high level. She is trusted with one of the most symbolically important acts in Egyptian kingship, the proper burial of a pharaoh. So Thutmose III is very young when his father dies. So I then wondered, what does that do to Hatshepsut's position? And I think to answer that, we need to reset our assumptions just ever so slightly. In the 18th dynasty, it's not at all unusual for the king of Egypt either to be a child or, if an adult, to be absent for long periods away on campaigns. The day-to-day business of governance is often carried out by others, and crucially, those others frequently include royal women. If you can imagine Hatshepsut growing up at court, she would have been surrounded by powerful female figures. Her mother, almost certainly, possibly her grandmother, and beyond them, a long ancestral memory of influential royal women. Egypt is not modern, but nor is it simplistic. Authority doesn't have to flow through men. So when Thutmose III inherits the throne as a child, it's entirely natural that Hatshepsut steps in as what we would instinctively call a regent, a trusted senior figure ruling on behalf of a minor king. Now, we should pause on that word, regent, because I then had to ask myself when I was thinking about that, is this a modern label that we're actually lazily imposing on the ancient past? And I think the answer is both yes and no. The Egyptians didn't use word regent in the way that later European monarchies did, but the concept is absolutely there. Someone holds power on behalf of the king. Someone is authorized and recognized and supported by the elite of the court. And in Hatshepsut's case, we have unusually strong evidence for that acceptance. Senior officials, powerful men at court, they all leave texts and inscriptions that acknowledge her authority after the death of Thutmose II. There is no sign of resistance at this stage, no sense that she is overreaching, and from the outset, the reins of power are firmly placed in her hands. That, of course, suggests something else to me. Hatshepsut may already have been acting in an unusually powerful way, even before her husband died. And of course, admittedly, that's my interpretation rather than proof. But it's very hard to escape the impression that she was not a passive figure suddenly thrust into prominence. She looks like someone who has actually been preparing, consciously or otherwise, for this role, to take on this authority. At this point, she's doing what's expected. She is ruling for the king. She is upholding tradition, and she's not yet challenging the system. But the really interesting question is, at what point does ruling for the king become ruling as the king? And this is where Hatshepsut stops being merely unusual and I think starts being extraordinary. And here's the thing about her. She doesn't content herself with being regent in the way previous royal women had done. She goes a decisive step further. She looks at the situation and, in effect, says, right then, I'm not just ruling for the king, I am the king. And she doesn't half do it either. She claims the full titulary of a pharaoh, king of Upper and Lower Egypt. 5 royal names. The whole shebang. She wants it. She takes it. She uses it. Now, that in itself is extraordinary. Normally, a queen might be known by her birth name, perhaps given one formal title. Hatshepsut doesn't stop there. She starts accumulating names left, right, and center, and in doing so, she is actually making a very clear statement. She is not acting like a pharaoh. She is the pharaoh. And that distinction really matters. There is a difference between saying you hold power and formalizing that power so completely that everyone else has to acknowledge it. She just doesn't accept the political reality that she is in control. She turns that reality into doctrine. And she does all of this while Thutmose III is still a child, still somewhere in the palace nursery. While he exists and is never erased, she occupies the throne. So I then wondered how she justified this beyond names and titles. And she actually does it in the Egyptian way, through time itself. So in ancient Egypt, dating doesn't work like our system of BCE and CE, AD, etc. Time resets with every reign. Year 1 begins when a new king comes to the throne. And I think it's here where Hatshepsut is both subtle and brilliant. She dates events jointly. Her reign is actually synchronized with that of Thutmose III. They share regal years. They share the throne in official time. And I think that point is really crucial. At no stage does she pretend that Thutmose III doesn't exist. She never erases him. She never claims he is illegitimate. Everything continues to be dated from the death of her predecessor. But she also appears as king. She commissions statues and reliefs, showing herself as pharaoh. She orders obelisks erected. She builds temples. She issues commands. She behaves publicly and ritually exactly as a king should. In other words, she pushes new ground. But she does so very cleverly while anchoring herself very firmly in tradition. And I think this is worth stressing. She's not inventing something unheard of. She has precedent, because around 300 years earlier, another woman, Sobek-Nefru, had ruled as a king. She took royal names. She too adopted the imagery and the language of kingship. Hatshepsut knows this history. She references it, and that's why she uses it. So this isn't actually an act of reckless innovation. It's a very carefully argued claim. Which brings me to how she chose to present herself visually, because this is where debate really heats up. I also then had to ask myself, is it fair to ask how she depicts herself? And I think the answer is absolutely. But we also notice something slightly uncomfortable at this stage. She comes in for a level of scrutiny that male pharaohs never have to face, because she's a woman. And because she's a woman, she is always treated as if she must be trying to trick people. And there's a tendency to fixate on what some see as a disconnect between the biological body and the official image. Statues, reliefs, inscriptions show her with the attributes of kingship, sometimes even including a false beard and very masculine dress. And that's led to endless speculation. Is she actually disguising herself? Is she actually trying to deceive her subjects? But this is where we need to be incredibly careful. Pharaoh was not a gendered role in the way that we instinctively imagine it. It was actually an office, a divine position. Kingship in Egypt was symbolic before it was biological. And when male pharaohs are shown as eternally youthful, perfectly proportioned, godlike beings, we don't accuse them of lying. We understand it as iconography. Hatshepsut deserves the same courtesy. She's not pretending to be a man, she's actually presenting herself as a king. And in ancient Egypt, those two things are not the same. They're very different. The living pharaoh never looked like his statues or reliefs. You know, the idealized figure carved in stone was not a portrait in the modern sense. It was a statement, a role, a set of divine attributes. And this is precisely why we can't really write a biography of an ancient Egyptian king in the way that we instinctively want to. You just can't. But because Hatshepsut was a female pharaoh, she has been subjected to a kind of scrutiny that male rulers almost entirely escape. A lot of Egyptology was shaped in the 19th century by bearded, upper-class European men who were deeply uncomfortable with the idea of a woman exercising absolute power, which is ironic because much of this scholarship was actually produced while Queen Victoria was actually on the throne, and nobody seemed especially troubled by that. And let's just take a quick break, and we'll be back in a second with part 2. Autonomous is your one-stop shop for your Malaysia My Second Home visa. But they are much, much more than that. When you sign up with Autonomous, you become part of a larger community. A community that actually cares about you and your family in Malaysia. And that's important when you move to a new home. For more information, go talk to TG or WhatsApp him on +60 12 49 37 270. Or visit their website, penangmyhome.com. And we're back. So what we are often seeing is not just Hatshepsut filtered through ancient evidence, but filtered through modern anxieties. And this is where symbolic nature of Egyptian art really matters. Egyptian art doesn't aim to capture individuality. It aims to express eternal truths. The pharaoh has a set visual grammar, certain proportions, certain attributes, and that grammar doesn't change very much at all over time. You know, for modern audiences, this is actually really, really hard to get our head around. We expect images to reflect bodies. The Egyptians expected images to reflect roles. There's actually a book being written at the moment about Egyptian faces and how we encounter them in museums, how we try to reconstruct them, how we project modern ideas of personality and realism into something that was actually never meant to work that way. With Hatshepsut, we see a transition. Chronologically, fairly clearly, there is a shift in how she is depicted. Early on, she appears more recognizably female, but as time goes on, the imagery becomes increasingly aligned with the fully male-coded iconography of a kingship. And that doesn't mean that she was dressing up as a man and wandering around the palace performing rituals in disguise. This is a modern misunderstanding. What it means is that the office of pharaoh was symbolically male. To be shown as a legitimate king, you had to be shown in male form. There was no alternative visual language available, so there is a period of experimentation. Around the year 7 of her reign, she is fully declaring herself pharaoh. And shortly after that, she is depicted entirely as a male king. Broad chest, royal kilt, crown, a false beard, a male body with the recognizable facial features of Hatshepsut. And of course, this has been described as a kind of pseudo-genealogical mask. And I think that gets it exactly right. What we are seeing is not her face. It's the mask of kingship, a symbolic identity layered over with an individual human being. So when you put all this together, the backdating of her rule, the imagery, the moments, it's tempting to ask, could we describe Hatshepsut as a kind of ancient PR genius? And I think the answer is yes, absolutely you could. She is intensely interested in precedent. She is brilliant at combining tradition with innovation. She is operating in genuinely new political territory. A woman ruling openly as pharaoh for years, over 20 years, not briefly, not apologetically, but confidently. That requires messaging. It requires consistency. It requires an inner circle who understand exactly what they are doing. Which brings me to one of the most important figures of her reign, a man called Senimut. Senimut is extraordinary. He holds more than 90 titles. He's architect, he's court official, he's tutor to the royal princesses, overseer of works. He's absolutely everywhere at this particular moment in time. And it seems very likely that he is the chief architect, not just of buildings, but also, importantly, of Hatshepsut's image. He appears early, probably when she is still queen, and he appears everywhere once she becomes pharaoh. And if you want a modern-day analogy, he is the spin doctor in chief. He understands symbolism, he understands history, he understands how to make something unprecedented look inevitable. And he's not alone. The officials around her leave an unusually rich paper trail, if we can call it that. We hear from priests, we hear from administrators and senior courtiers. Most importantly, we hear from the high priest of Amun, a man by the name of Hatshepsut. These are all powerful men, and they support her, which actually tells us something crucial. She is not ruling against the system. She is ruling through the system. She has persuaded the elite that her kingship is not a disruption of order, but actually a continuation of order. And in ancient Egypt, that was everything. And I think what's interesting is that Senimut, for all his visibility, is not actually the most powerful man in the kingdom. You might expect that the highest profile figures around a pharaoh would be the obvious heavyweights, but the court is actually more layered than that. The most senior political figure is the vizier, effectively what Egyptologists rather clunkily call a prime minister. And in her reign, that role is held by Amun. He is the administrator-in-chief responsible for law, taxation, oversight of officials, effectively the machinery of the state. And of course, then there are other figures that we can glimpse through the reliefs and inscriptions, including the royal butler, Nehesi. And he's actually depicted as bringing in wine, food, and luxury goods as a reminder that proximity to the ruler actually mattered enormously. Taken together, we can build up a surprisingly vivid picture of the people around her. These are men who both enable her slightly unconventional kingship and are themselves completely enabled by it. And I think that works both ways. Royal favor is everything in pharaonic court. If the king doesn't like you, your career is over, sometimes permanently. So courts are competitive ecosystems, elite jockeying for position. And Hatshepsut's favor, it seems, was highly sought after, which tells us also something really important. She is not a marginal or contested figure within her own court. She's actually the center of it. Now, I've talked a lot about co-rulership, and that raises, I think, a very obvious question. How did this actually function in practice? How was power shared between her and Thutmose III? The honest answer, I think, is with difficulty. The evidence we have is iconographic and textual, not narrative. We don't have meeting minutes or private correspondence to refer back to. But what we do see is that her name and image appear far more prominently than Thutmose III's, especially in the early years. But of course, that's hardly surprising. He is a child. She is an experienced adult. Where things get a little bit tricky is how this has been interpreted by historians. Early Egyptologists, especially in the 19th and earlier 20th centuries, were deeply suspicious of her. She's described in frankly moralistic terms as an unscrupulous woman. When she disappears from record around the year 22 of the co-rulership and Thutmose III comes into his own as a young man, it's assumed that he must have been biding his time, resentful, waiting to reclaim what was rightfully his. She was cast as a kind of wicked stepmother figure, blocking his destiny. But I think that reading says far more about Victorian attitudes than it actually does about ancient Egypt. And I think there's another possibility. And I think it's a much more persuasive one. A shared rulership, a prolonged regency, if you like, is one of the safest ways to secure the throne for a junior party. Thutmose III is absolutely the junior party here, but by ruling alongside him, Hatshepsut stabilizes the kingdom, protects his legitimacy, and ensures that when he does take full power, the transition is a smooth one. And I think there's something else too. Thutmose III goes on to be one of Egypt's greatest kings, a formidable military commander, a highly successful ruler, and he reigns for another 30 plus years. He comes to the throne as a baby and rules into his 50s. So I don't think it's unreasonable to imagine that Hatshepsut taught him how to be king, that he learned statecraft, ritual, and authority by being at her side. And I think also that rather than resenting her, he may well have respected her, loved her as the woman who made his reign entirely possible. And of course, this isn't something that I can prove, but it fits the evidence just as well as the darker, more melodramatic Victorian version. And I think it reminds us of something essential. History isn't just what happened, it's how we decide to tell it. And if Hatshepsut's story has too often been told through suspicion rather than through the remarkable stability and success of the world that she helped create, then we're doing her an injustice. It's an amazing story. The tragedy, I think, is the story that everyone hears, is that her name and memory were viciously erased by Thutmose III, driven by resentment, by fury, and a desire to wipe his stepmother from history. And look, that's also a wonderful story, but it doesn't really stand up. And as you might expect, the truth is more complicated and I think, frankly, much, much more interesting. For a long time, I think it was assumed that this was the revenge of a young warrior king, a man hardened by military campaigns, finally taking the throne and striking back at the woman who had overshadowed him. But when you actually look at the archaeology, the timing simply doesn't fit. Hatshepsut's disappearance from the record happens when presumably she dies, around the year 22 of the co-rulership. But the systematic targeting of her name and image doesn't begin until much later, probably around year 42 of Thutmose III's reign. And this is a gap roughly of 20 years. If you truly hated someone, if this were personal, if it were emotional, driven by resentment, why wait 2 decades? And I think the answer lies not in psychology, but in dynastic politics. By that point, Thutmose III is no longer consolidating his own rule. He's actually preparing the succession. He's setting up a co-rulership for his son, Amenhotep II. And here is the crucial detail. Amenhotep II's claim to the throne runs through his mother, who comes from a different branch of the royal family. To strengthen his son's legitimacy, Thutmose III needs to emphasize his own male lineage and de-emphasize alternative routes to power. And Hatshepsut represents exactly that alternative, a woman who ruled as king, a different dynastic logic. So I think what happens is not a tantrum, not an emotional purge, but a selective, targeted reworking of her memory. Her name and image are removed when they complicate the story of Thutmose III and what he wants to tell us about succession. It's effectively political housekeeping. And I think there's archaeology that supports this. At Karnak, the sequence of building tells a careful story. Some of Hatshepsut's monuments are respected, incorporated, they're built around. Others are altered or concealed. The damage is phased. I think it's very deliberate and it's practical. This isn't a frenzy of destruction. It's controlled editing, if you like. And the consequences of that have been incredibly severe for her reputation. Hatshepsut did extraordinary things. She sent ambitious international trading expeditions. She built on a scale rarely matched. She ruled for more than 20 years and did the whole pharaonic job exceptionally well. Had she been born male, there is little doubt in my mind that she would sit comfortably among the greatest pharaohs of the new kingdom. Instead, she becomes defined by absence, by damaged reliefs, by erased names. Her legacy is filtered through loss. But you know what? Even that erasure was never complete. 500 years after her death, people still knew who she was. Royal children were named after her. Her mortuary temple remained a place of pilgrimage. There was a folk memory, a reverberation of her reign that never entirely faded. She was never forgotten. She was just complicated. So let me just flip that question on its head. If we strip away the later damage and the modern discomfort, what does her reign actually look like? And the first word that comes to my mind is prosperous. Undoubtedly so. Based on the surviving evidence, Egypt thrives under her rule. And I think it's also true that much of what we see comes from the south, from Thebes, from modern Luxor, where survival conditions have been very kind. If you go looking for her in Memphis, the old northern capital now buried beneath modern Cairo, you will find very little. That raises an important question. Is this imbalance real or an accident of archaeology? And I think it actually could be both. But what I can say is that she builds extensively across Egypt. She sends out remarkable long-distance trading expeditions. She maintains military readiness. And crucially, she has an amazing understanding of power. There is a lazy assumption that because she was a woman, she must have been soft, diplomatic, peace-loving, if you like. But the evidence actually doesn't support that at all. She depicts herself as a sphinx trampling foreign enemies. She threatens those who question her authority. She makes it very clear that doubting her power will have consequences. She's not sensitive. She means business. Everything we can see suggests that her time on the throne was a period of stability, of prosperity, and of confidence for Egypt. It was a reign that actually worked incredibly well. And I think in the end, that alone may be the most powerful argument of all. But if we just pause and break this down, one of the obvious questions is this. What did Hatshepsut actually build? What can people still see today that belongs unmistakably to her? If there's anyone out there that actually recognizes her name at all, they will probably associate her work with one extraordinary monument, her great temple at Deir el-Bahri on the west bank of modern Luxor. We often call it a mortuary temple, but I think that's actually a rather clumsy Egyptological, if that's a word, term. Hatshepsut herself refers to it as a mansion of millions of years. And I don't think it's about death in the modern sense. It's about eternity. It's where the cult of the king is celebrated alongside the gods. And I have to say, it's one of the most graceful buildings ever constructed, terraced, elegant, perfectly integrated into the cliffs behind it. I think it draws consciously on earlier precedents that there are older temples nearby, but this is something new. There is innovation here in form and scale and certainly in ambition. And I would say that most of this seems to have been overseen by Senimut, who functions not just as an administrator, as I mentioned earlier on, but as a kind of architect of ideas. And together they take tradition and they stretch it. To understand these buildings, it helps to understand one of Hatshepsut's names. Her birth name is Hatshepsut, which means foremost of noble women. But she actually adds something crucial. In ancient Egyptian, she becomes Hatshepsut, Matkare, united with Amun. And this isn't decorative theology. It's actually a very strong political and religious strategy. Amun is her divine father. She tells us this explicitly. In scenes carved into stone, she describes how her mother was visited not only by Thutmose I, but also by Amun himself, who entered her mother's chamber and conceived the future king. Now, in the past, people have actually treated this as special pleading. A woman, they say, needs extra justification. But this is standard pharaonic theology. Male pharaohs say exactly the same thing. I am the son of the god. Hatshepsut is simply making the logic explicit. And of course, she wants to be remembered. And she tells us that too. At Karnak, she erects a series of colossal obelisks, perhaps as many as 6. And on the base of one, there is a wonderful inscription in which she essentially says, I am telling you this so that the people in the future will know that it was I who built these things. And here we are, 3,500 years later, doing exactly that. We are fulfilling her wish. It was not giants, it was not aliens, it was actually Hatshepsut. She also revels in names. You know, her throne name, Matkare, means something like truth in the spirit of Ra. She takes titles that describes her as strong and spirited, green of years, but also enduring. One of the most revealing is one that can be translated as divider of appearances. And I think that's fascinating. It tells you exactly what she is doing. She is playing with visibility, with divinity, with the boundary between human and God. And in doing so, she pushes the idea of royal divinity further than many of her predecessors. Later kings like Amenhotep III and Ramesses III, they'll take that much further. But the roots of that are actually here. And then there are the exceptions. We often talk about them as tribute missions, but I think that's a little bit misleading. What Hatshepsut sends out are trading expeditions. The most famous is to the mysterious land of Punt, described as the land of the gods, somewhere around the Horn of Africa, perhaps even modern-day Somaliland or Eritrea. And the logistics are astounding. Ships are built on the Nile, dismantled, hauled across the desert to the Red Sea, reassembled, and then sent out into open water. And for Egyptians who were essentially river people, this was genuinely frightening. But they return with gold and incense, panther skins, exotic woods, monkeys, giraffes, even living incense trees. This is like a pharaonic Noah's Ark, and everything is recorded in glorious detail on the walls of Deir el-Bahri. And anything could have happened to that expedition. There were no communications. months, years could pass without any note of what was going on. And then suddenly they're back, they're laden with wealth, and it's a triumph of organization and confidence. There are also innovations too. Hatshepsut effectively inaugurates the Valley of the Kings as a place of royal burial. She has her father reburied and prepares her own tomb in relation to his. She introduces religious texts into burial chambers that hadn't been used that way before. She's also obsessed with sphinxes. Kings before had them, of course, but she is the first ruler that we can point to who actually installs them in vast numbers. At Deir el-Bahri, there may have been 70. And when you think of the long avenues of sphinxes in Egypt, that imagery really begins with her. So how does it end? Well, as with so much else, uncertainty surrounds her death. She may have come to the throne in her 20s and died in her 40s, which of course isn't unusual for ancient Egypt. There's been much debate about identifying her mummy, including confusion with her nurse, Sitri-In. And of course, there was even a tooth in a box bearing her name. But I don't think that's the smoking gun some would like it to be. She is officially omitted from later king lists. When Ramesses II commissions lists of past rulers, she's not there. But omission is not the same as oblivion. Egyptians still knew who she was centuries later. Her temple remained active, her name echoed. I actually strongly suspect that Thutmose III ensured she was buried with respect. I'd like to think that. And I think that, like most ancient Egyptians, her body probably simply just didn't survive. So what of her reputation since? She has been known since the very beginning of modern Egyptology. Jean-Francois Champollion, working with the Rosetta Stone, noticed something very odd when he found it. The grammar didn't seem to quite work. Masculine and feminine pronouns were mixed. And he was the one who realized for the first time in over a millennium that something extraordinary had been going on. And he called her the King Queen. Victorians, of course, were deeply suspicious of her, but I think she is rehabilitated in the 20th century. And today, she's become something close to a pop culture figure. Her temple is still accessible, books are being rewritten, and people now know her name. I think she deserves a proper book and a proper film. Forget Cleopatra. Hatshepsut gives you power, theology, architecture, ambition, memory, and I think a legacy like no other. And unlike Cleopatra, we actually have the evidence to prove it. She wasn't just a woman who ruled like a man. She was a great pharaoh. This episode of Rearview Mirror Chronicles is brought to you by Entrepot Publishing, the home of independent storytelling. We publish books that celebrate history, art, and the extraordinary people who make life fascinating. You can find our titles and maybe your next great read at entrepotpublishing.com. Thanks for listening in, folks. Bye for now.